How's it going, everyone? There is a simple equation that describes pretty much all role-playing games. And this equation applied to Diablo 4 actually reveals why Diablo 4 initially got relatively decent reviews, and then everything took a sharp U-turn and reviews started getting really bad really fast. Those unfamiliar with the title, Diablo 4 was a recently released sequel to one of the most popular role-playing game, if not one of the most popular video game series of all time. Reviews were initially decent, and then suddenly everything went really bad. Bad reviews, a lot of people stopped playing it, and the simple equation explains why. So let's get into it. The role-playing game genre is essentially where you are building a warrior that gets stronger over time, and a key characteristic of that warrior is their damage. Now, the damage is actually a random value. For example, maybe it's determined by rolling 2 6-sided dice. Well, then the damage could be anywhere from 2 to 12, but on average it's going to be a 7. So this D with a bar on top is going to represent average damage. A lot of the time in mathematics, a bar is used to represent average. So this is average damage per turn if it's a turn-based game, or per second if it's a real-time game. Now I'm going to say per second in this video because Diablo 4 is a real-time game, but you can replace that for per turn and the mathematics is the same. So this is your average damage per second, assuming that you're hitting every single time. But you might not hit every single time, so that's multiplied by accuracy, which is the probability of hitting. If you're going to be doing, say, 10 damage per second, if you hit every single time, but you only hit half the time, well, you're actually doing only 5 damage per second. So A times D bar, that represents your expected damage per second. Now, for how many seconds can you actually do this damage? Well, that's the number of seconds that you stay on your feet. And what's that? Well, it's your hit points or health points, which is the amount of damage you can receive, divided by the expected damage that your enemies do per second, right? So this is monster accuracy times monster damage, average monster damage, right? So that's the amount of seconds that you still have health points, that you're still on your feet. That total amount of seconds multiplied by the expected damage per second that you can deal, as long as that is greater than the monster's health, then you win the fight. And then you can go to town and heal and whatever. Okay. Now, HM, AM, DM, this might represent a single monster. It can represent a mob of monsters. Either way, it represents the total health of that set of enemies or enemy that you're facing simultaneously, and their average accuracy and average damage. Now, there is one more factor in this equation, but before I show that factor, I'm actually going to multiply both sides of the equation by AM and DM bar, because that'll make the next factor a little bit easier to understand. So, multiplying both sides of the equation by AM and DM bar, we get H. We get H A D bar greater than HM AM DM bar. And we get a rather simple, elegant looking equation here. So on the right side, you have your character's health, accuracy, and damage. And on the left side, you have the monster's health, accuracy, and damage. And as long as the product of the character's attributes are greater than the product of the monster's attributes, then you win the fight. Because this is the same equation as up here, just rearranged to bring these two to the other side of the equation. Now, what's this other parameter that I'm talking about? There's a M right here, which represents a character's magical abilities, like spells or special skills, that sort of thing. In different games, they're called different things, but the idea is the same. It is a multiplier that boosts your character's strength. So for example, maybe your character has a spell that doubles your health. okay, like mana shield, okay? Well, that's like multiplying that side of the equation by 2, okay? Maybe your character has a spell that triples your damage but cuts your accuracy in half, right? Like maybe a barbarian going berserk, right? Well, that's like multiplying this equation by 3 over 2, right? Because the D is tripled and the A is cut in half, okay? Maybe your character has an ability that affects the monsters. Maybe it cuts monster accuracy in half. Well, that's a divided by 2 here, but you can bring it to the other side of the equation and it becomes multiplying by a factor of 2 on the left side of the equation. So all of those different spells abilities can be represented by this factor m. Now, because you're using different abilities at different times, we're going to put a bar there as well. So this is your average m value, the average boost that you get from these magical abilities or special skills. So that is every single role-playing game in a nutshell. This equation right here. Okay? And as a game progresses, you get points that allow you to boost these 4 attributes. And in doing so, you grow more powerful than the monsters that you had previously been fighting. So monsters that used to be manageable become easy. Monsters that used to be impossibly difficult become manageable. And so on. That's how it progresses. Now you can also customize your character by choosing which attributes you put points into, right? So maybe you want a character who does a lot of damage and can soak up a lot of damage, but they're not very accurate, right? So that it takes them a long time to land a hit, but when they do land a hit, it is a hard hit. And they can soak up a lot of damage while they're waiting for that hard hit. Or maybe you want a warrior who has pretty good accuracy and some magical ability. So they can't get hit a lot, but they can stay far away and attack from far away and chip away at their enemies that way. Maybe you want a character who doesn't have any of these physical attributes very high, but they have really strong magical ability, and that's where they get all their power from. Maybe you want a character who's pretty good at a bunch of different skills or spells. Or maybe you want a character who's really, really, really good at one spell and not so good at the others and focuses on that one spell or skill, right? So you might be putting a lot of points into one particular skill and not a lot of points in others. So all of that customization is also part of the game, okay? And that ties into another key component of role-playing games, which is the story. So typically there are certain missions, fights that you have to complete in order to see the main story of the game. It's like watching a TV show, but to see the next episode, you have to solve a mathematical equation. And that's likely something that would make kids better at math, right? So, and you do have to solve this equation because different builds might be good for different fights, right? So some enemies might be really good at getting close to you, right? So being really accurate and staying far away might not work. Other characters, enemies might be really good at staying far away, right? So you have to have good accuracy because you have to fight them from far away. Other enemies might be immune to magical effects, so that won't work on them. So you always have to, not always, but often have to re-optimize, recalibrate this equation. So it is a math puzzle. So you have these main missions that you have to complete and go through, but eventually it's inevitable that you get to a point where you just can't get any further. The monsters are way too difficult. You just cannot win that fight. And this is where something called side quests come in, right? So there's the missions you have to do, but then there's other missions available that you actually don't have to do to see the main story, but they are there as an option. And what happens when you get to that point that you just cannot pass, well, then you go back and you start doing the side quests to get the points to boost these attributes so your character gets stronger relative to the monster so that eventually you can break through that mission that you couldn't break through before. And so the process continues. That's pretty much all role-playing games in a nutshell. Now, what happens if we apply this to Diablo IV? Well, to see the context that players were entering Diablo 4 from, we're going to see, well, what happened in Diablos 1, 2, and 3? So in Diablos 1, 2, and 3, when you level up, right, that's when you defeat enough monsters that you level up, right, you get points that you can contribute to these attributes, right? So there was strength that would boost your damage, and depending on the weapon, it might boost your accuracy. There was dexterity, which would boost your accuracy. Depending on the weapon, it might boost your damage. There was vitality that would boost your health. And there was, in Diablo 1, it was called magic. In Diablo 2, it was called energy. And that would boost your magic. Effectively, it would boost all of these M values by a little bit. Like maybe this would become 2.1, 3.2, 2.2, and so on. Now, you also had skill points that you can contribute to specific skills or spells, right? And so maybe you want to boost specifically M1 by a more substantial amount. So maybe that will become a 2.7 instead of a 2.1, and so on. Now, in Diablo 1, they weren't called skill points. You actually had to find books throughout the world that boosted particular spells by a certain amount, but it's the same idea. Now, in Diablo 3, all of that customization was gone, right? So you couldn't use these points to boost these attributes independently or decide which skills you want to boost independently. Whenever you level up in Diablo 3, these attributes, these factors in the equation, would boost automatically by a preset amount. Every one of your skills would also boost automatically by a preset amount. You don't get to choose which skill, which attribute boosts by how much. You can indirectly control it a bit through items that you find, but you can't more directly control it by putting points into attributes or skills. When you level up, you might gain access to more skills, but you still don't get to choose what these values are. So the only customization that existed in Diablo 3 was just picking which of these skills are the ones that you're going to choose, and hence the ones that will contribute to your average ebb value. Much less customization, and that upset a lot of players. Now, they still enjoyed the game to an extent. Diablo 3 is often described as a good game, but not nearly as good as Diablos 1 and 2. So what Diablo 4 did, they actually returned customization where you can specify which skills you add skill points to, right? So you can add more points to the skills you like, add no points to the skills that you don't like. So that level of customization returned, which effectively affects your M value as well. Now, as for dexterity, strength, and all that would boost these parameters, that was still something you could not contribute to with attribute points from leveling up. So it was more limited customization than in Diablos 2, and, well, yeah, more limited than Diablo 1, you could say. But on top of that, there was also a maximum cap for how many points you could put into each of these skills, right? As a result, it forced you to diversify your character in terms of what skills they use, right? So you couldn't dump all your points into one skill, be really good at that one thing, and not good at anything else. That wasn't an option in Diablo 4 either. So it was more limited customization, but it was more than Diablo 3, and people liked that. They were excited about that. They started playing the game. They started going through the story. They were enjoying it, and then it all crashed. And then suddenly everyone started enjoying it much less, and here's why. And to show why, I'm going to take this part of the equation, I'm going to bring it over to the other side. I'm going to divide both sides of the equation by these three parameters representing monster abilities or monster capability. And what we get, we have M bar, H, A, D bar divided by HM, AM, DM, and that has to be greater than 1. Okay, so the factors representing your character's performance divided by the factors representing the monster's performance has to be greater than 1. And the more greater than 1 it is, the more powerful your characters are, when facing those monsters. And so as that top value grows, manageable monsters become easy, too difficult monsters become manageable. Except for in Diablo 4. Because in Diablo 4, there's something called level scaling, where as your character levels up and becomes stronger, the same monsters, all the monsters, also scale to the character and become stronger. So let's say you level up a bunch of times and you end up with a factor of 2 here. Your character is twice as powerful as they were before. Maybe their health is twice as much, or maybe their damage and health and magical ability, all that boosts to the effect of having a 2 there. Well, as that's happening, the creatures are also becoming more powerful, the same creatures, and so you end up with a 2 down here as well, right? So the monster's health times accuracy times damage, well, that becomes twice as powerful as well. And what happens with those 2s? Well, they cancel out, because 2 divided by 2 is 1, and you're right back to where you started. So the manageable monsters don't become easy. They become stronger as you get stronger. The more difficult monsters don't become more manageable. They stay at the same difficulty level. And that defeats the purpose of the game. By the way, Diablo 3 and 4 also remove this accuracy parameter, right? So every shot that you take will hit as long as you can click on the enemy. That also made customization of builds more limited. So the important thing is these 2s canceling out. So your character doesn't get stronger relative to those same monsters. So people would go through the story, right? Because it's like that TV show that they want to watch, right? They want to know what happens in the story. They would go through the story, finish those missions, and after that, they'd say, there's nothing to do. They'd say, I had fun playing the game, but then it just got boring. Well, if you're playing a game and there's no progress, what happens? You get bored, right? That classic situation in role-playing games where you get to a mission that you just cannot beat because your attributes are not high enough and you have to go back and start doing side quests. Well, that wouldn't happen in Diablo 4 because there are no missions, pretty much no missions that are too difficult to beat, that you have to go and do side quests, because all enemies are always manageable. And so people would report, well, I find myself, there's no point in doing the side quests. I'm not clearing every corner of the dungeon. I'm not taking every treasure that I find, or doing it much less than in previous games. And some players, they didn't realize exactly why it is that they're not finding it fun. They just reported that they're getting bored, they're not doing side quests and all that. Others were more aware of it, and they said directly that, well, the monsters that were, somewhat manageable at the start of the game, they're still somewhat manageable much, much later when the character is much more powerful and nothing is particularly challenging. What's the point of playing? If you're enjoying the story, you can play until you finish the story, and after that, they just feel there's nothing fun to do. And that's what the math would predict if you implement level scaling. And that initial return of some customization gave players an initial boost and made those initial reviews good. And then once the bulk of fans finished the story, or even before that, they felt like, okay, well, the game's boring though. There's no progress. There's no serious challenges. And that's all predicted in this mathematics, right? Now, there could be other things that you could judge the game based on, right? You could talk about artwork, you could talk about story and those other components. Here I'm talking specifically about the game dynamics. It's all predicted in this equation, that there would be an initial set of relatively good reviews, and then suddenly people would just get bored. So I hope that explains the phenomena to you. I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time.